So the focus of today's video is to explain what should be included in your body paragraph. This is for Thursday, April 2nd. So when we deconstructed the prompt yesterday, we decided that the focus of this essay was to 1. Examine how Roger and Greg's feelings towards Mrs. Jones and Lemon Brown changes throughout the text. And the second thing that we were going to examine was the advice that Mrs. Jones and Lemon Brown gave Roger and Greg, and what lesson these two boys learned as a result. Now, we know that when we write a body paragraph, we should start off by writing a topic sentence. Then we're going to continue by adding an example, then our evidence. When we explain the evidence, we're going to make sure that we incorporate key phrases from the prompt in your explanation. And finally, we're going to elaborate. I want you to make sure that you add a minimum of 2 vocabulary words and 2 transition words in your body paragraph. For the focus of today's body paragraph, we're going to look at source 1, which is "Thank you, ma'am." Now, for our topic sentence, I provided some tips. You must start with a transition word. In this case, I'm using "to begin with." Then you have to state the name of the text. And then finally, you're going to briefly introduce this topic. So you can mention the characters, the conflict, and how the protagonist feels. I provided 2 examples. So if you take a look here, there is a simplified version of the topic sentence. And in the second example, we've been focusing on taking compositional risk and how you can challenge yourself when writing. So our simplified sentence would read like this. To begin with, in the text, "Thank you, ma'am," Roger tries to steal Mrs. Jones' purse so he can buy shoes. If you were to take a compositional risk, you would say something like, to begin with, in the text, "Thank you, ma'am," the protagonist Roger vigorously attempts to snatch the purse of Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones. After we are done with our topic sentence, you move on to your example. Now, for your example, I would like you to focus on how Roger feels when he first meets Mrs. Jones. Our first example, which is a simplified version again, is Mrs. Jones stops Roger from stealing her purse and forces him to return home with her. Roger is afraid that Mrs. Jones will call the cops on him. So here I made sure that I notated how Roger felt when he first met Mrs. Jones. In my compositional risk example, I said, to Roger's surprise, Mrs. Jones is able to avert his advances, and instead, she firmly grips his shirt and compels him to follow her home. Roger is filled with trepidation at the potential of being turned in to the authorities. So now I want to go ahead and I want to clarify what the difference is between my simplified version and a version in which I take compositional risk. If you notice, typically when I state that you're not taking compositional risk, it's because your sentences are short or they're choppy. In this case, it's a little bit different. When I'm taking compositional risk, not only am I including vocabulary words, but I'm using more descriptive words, right? So instead of just saying that Roger stole Mrs. Jones' purse, I'm saying that Mrs. Jones is able to avert his advances, right? Advances means that he's coming towards her and attempting to do something to her. In this case, it's stealing her purse, which the reader can infer. In addition to that, instead of saying that Roger is afraid or that Roger is scared, I'm going ahead and I'm saying that Roger is filled with trepidation, and I'm explaining that it's because of the potential of being turned into the authorities. Finally, I'm also using descriptive words to say how Mrs. Jones firmly gripped his shirt and she compels him to follow her home. So here I'm describing how she grabs his shirt and how she's forcing him to follow her home. So after our example goes our evidence. Now you guys can choose which piece of evidence you want to include in your body paragraph. For example, you can select a piece of evidence that supports one of the following: how Roger feels, what Mrs. Jones does for Roger, and what Mrs. Jones tries to teach Roger. In my case, I picked Meyer, that's our author, writes, and your face is dirty. I got a great mind to wash your face for you. She heated some lima beans and ham. She had in the icebox, made the cocoa, and set the table. So when we explain our evidence, you are going to note how Roger's feelings towards Mrs. Jones changes, and you're going to add how Mrs. Jones treats Roger. For instance, Roger's feelings towards Mrs. Jones changes throughout the story. Since Mrs. Jones is nice to him, he learns an important lesson. The second example is that although Roger initially felt afraid that Mrs. Jones may call the police, her kindness caused him to change his attitude and learn a valuable lesson. For our elaboration of details, you're going to focus on what do Roger and Mrs. Jones discuss, what advice does Mrs. Jones share with Roger, and what lesson does Roger learn at the very end. Mrs. Jones tells Roger how when she was young, she also wanted things she could not have. In the end, Mrs. Jones gives Roger $10 and he learns he should not steal or misbehave. Mrs. Jones shares how when she was young, she also desired things she could not afford. In the end, Roger feels a sense of gratitude because Mrs. Jones offered him the $10 he needed to buy new shoes. Thus, it is evident that Roger's interaction with Mrs. Jones teaches him the imperative lesson to behave properly and not steal. Now, this is the final product of my body paragraph. If you look at this, you can see that I only took the examples in which I took compositional risk and I put those together to create this final product. Click pause now if you want to go ahead and read that to yourself. Now, once you have read this final product to yourself, I want you to go ahead and write paragraph 3. For paragraph 3, you are writing about the treasure of lemon brown. Now, while I did not provide you with an example for paragraph 3, you do have that outline in the Google Docs that breaks up sentence by sentence what should be included. If you feel that you are struggling still to come up with ideas, then go back to the beginning of the video where I offer you tips on how to write this body paragraph. Start with the topic sentence. While the examples are not the same, the tips are the same. So your topic sentence is going to begin with a transition word, then you're going to state the name of the text, and you're going to introduce the topic and characters. The same thing here. You're going to follow the tips for your example, but instead of focusing on how Roger feels, you're going to focus on how Greg feels when he first meets Mr. Lemon Brown, and so on. If you need any assistance, feel free to send me a message on Google Classroom, and I will be more than happy to assist you.